Now today I want to share a story, someone else's story, not my story. We'll get to who in a moment. A story that I hope will encourage you mostly to trust God, to really, truly trust Him more. A story that I hope will build your faith. And I don't get this from nowhere. I don't just pluck this out of the clouds. Because we hear in Hebrews 12, some words maybe that are well known, but in Hebrews 12 verses 1 and 2, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, so Christians who have gone before us, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Basically, it is saying that in our race of faith, you have a race of faith. The finish line is God. He's the finish line. But on the way, there are others cheering you on. They've already run the race ahead of you and got to Him. They've died. But they are cheering you on in your race of faith. They are there to encourage you and to encourage I to keep going. And we should listen to them. These Christians who have died probably lived in a different time, probably in a different culture. Maybe they spoke a different language to us, but they have the same faith as you and I, and they encourage us to keep going. They encourage us to throw off the things that would hold us back in our race of faith. And I hope the person I share with you today does that for you. Because I absolutely believe he is one of these cheerleaders of the faith. Someone who has gone before you and I. So who is it? Well, let me introduce George Muller. He lived from 1805 to 1898, so 92 years out of that century. It's a pretty good innings, isn't it? And the 1800s, I wasn't there, but they were a busy century. The steam locomotive was built for the first time. Antarctica was discovered. Pride and Prejudice was written. The trumpet got valves. Didn't have valves before that. And maybe a little closer to home for us, 1840, a plucky wee nation decided it was going to give it a go together with the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. Quite a bit going on in that century, isn't there? But why are we visiting George Muller amongst all of these things? Well, George Muller, he's best known for looking after orphans. Specifically, and it is very specific, in his lifetime, 10,024 of them. He had a few helpers. He wasn't doing it all himself, but he was the man who started it. Now, I've got 3 kids. One of them's on the way, admittedly. But life feels like a challenge. But 10,024, that's a lot of kids. That's more than the population of Waipak, isn't it? And when I say he looked after orphans, these were kids who had lost both parents. Both of their parents were dead. And unfortunately, in the 1800s, particularly in England, there wasn't a shortage of them. There were lots of them around. Aside from orphanages, George also had an interest in education. Perhaps that is not surprising given how many kids he had around him. But he started 117 schools over the course of his life. In fact, he supplied education to so many children, well in excess of 100,000, that he was accused, get this is an accusation, accused of raising the poor above their natural station in life. Isn't that the most wonderful accusation? No one has said that about me, and I feel like I'm lacking. Those are 2 really big things he's known for, caring for orphans and schools, education. And we can't ignore them, and we shouldn't ignore them. But what I really want us to focus on is actually why he did this and how he did it. Why and how. And I think you might be a little surprised by the answers to those 2. Why and how. But before we get to them, we've got to start at the start. George was born in Prussia, which doesn't even exist today, but it's modern-day Germany. His father was a tax collector for the government, and money will become a bit of a theme in his story, so note it every time it comes up. George's mother died when he was 14, and George says of that time, these are his own words, "I was 14 years old when my mother was suddenly removed. The night she was dying, I, not knowing of her illness, was playing cards till 2 a.m, and on the next day, being the Lord's Day, Sunday, I went with some of my companions in sin to a tavern, and then we went about the streets half intoxicated." This is 14. George is very honest in his autobiography that he wasn't the best son ever. He puts it a bit more bluntly than that. Here he is at 14, staying away from home, didn't even know his mum was sick, and he spent the next day getting drunk. 14 years old. But it doesn't stop there. Remember I mentioned that his dad was a tax collector for the government? Well, George was also a thief. He stole from everyone and anyone, including his dad, which was effectively stealing from the country of Prussia, funny enough. But he also stole from his friends. In one instance, his tax collector father was a bit suspicious. Money was disappearing. And when money for a tax collector disappears, he's got to make it up somehow. And he was a bit suspicious of George, so George was sitting in a room one day and his father left some money in the same room, pile of coins. He went out. He came back and he counted the money and there was less there. And he asked George about this money. Where had it vanished to? And George proclaimed innocence. He didn't know. And his father searched him and found the money in George's shoe. That did not go down well with George's dad. But it did not stop George from stealing. He would go and use hotel rooms and leave before paying. He would steal from his friends, and he himself notes that he was like Judas amongst the disciples, because as he and his friends travelled around, I don't know if it's because his dad was a tax collector, but he would hold the common purse and he would siphon off money for himself, even from his friends. He was not a particularly great friend in many regards. Now, his father wanted him to train to be a minister because this would be a secure job. A minister in Prussia at this time was a government job, a civil job. It was just something you did, really. You didn't necessarily need to have a spiritual basis to it. So if this is where George started, what changed in his life? Because there was a big change. And we don't know for sure, but we know one of the key moments, not the only moment, but one of the key moments happened in a small group Bible study. George went along because someone had invited him, because that's why people go along to small groups. And he observed someone's faith which had a real effect on him. Let me read his description of this time. So this is in a Bible study. Then Brother Kaiser fell on his knees and asked a blessing on this meeting. This kneeling down made a deep impression on me, for I had never either seen anyone on his knees, nor had I ever myself prayed on my knees. He then read a chapter of the Bible and a printed sermon, for no regular meetings for expounding the scriptures were allowed in Prussia, except when an ordained clergyman was present. While he prayed, my feeling was something like this: I could not pray as well, though I am much more learned than this illiterate man. The whole experience made a deep impression on me. I was happy, though if I had been asked why I was happy, I could not have clearly explained it. You know, when the man asked for a blessing on that meeting, I don't think he knew what that blessing would be. And I don't think George did either, but there was a blessing on that meeting, particularly in George's life. Now, I don't think George was a Christian here, but God was at work in him. In this Bible study, George saw someone's living faith someone relating to the living God, and God started to relate with George. And I think George describes well the experience of faith here. Often we don't know what is happening to us as it is happening. We only know something's happening. It's only after the fact we look back and go, oh, God was there. God was at work in me. And this Bible study in some ways would set up George for his life, because prayer, heartfelt prayer, was to become a defining feature of his life and his relationship with God. And his relationship with God does indeed grow from here. I'm skipping over quite a lot, but George, he does indeed come to faith. He reaches out to his father and brother to seek the Lord. He shares his faith with them, so he's quite evangelistic. And at the same time, he starts to read missionary reports from overseas, and these get him excited about missions, and he wants to join them on the mission field. He wants to become a missionary. Now let's remember that 14-year-old I spoke about just before. George is not 14 here, but let's remember that 14-year-old, the half-drunk thief. George has come quite a way, hasn't he? But he's not finished yet. Now, you might think George's father, who wanted him to be a minister, would be happy about all of these developments in his son's life. George did indeed stop stealing at this stage. But no, his dad was not happy about these events in his son's life. In fact, George's tax collector father was quite angry about George's faith and missionary interest, because he'd spent a lot of money educating George in the hope that he would be able to retire comfortably when George had a stable job. And all of a sudden, that was looking less likely. Well, it was going to get wilder yet. And it was with this growing interest in missions that George took off to England. Initially, he worked there as a missionary to Jews in London. This didn't last for too long, and yet God was working in all of these things. And through a series of events, he ended up ministering in a church in Bristol. Now, what is funny about this, well, I think it's funny, is that in a way, George did fulfill his father's wishes to become a minister, just not how he had hoped. And George's father would likely have been more upset with what George did there as a minister. In that time, and again, this is the 1800s, many churches raised their incomes by pew rents, P-E-W, pew rents. Essentially, they rented out seats, and a family or an individual would pay a rent for that seat. So that was their seat, and that was the way churches, many of them, gained their income. Sounds a bit bizarre to us, but this was a fairly common practice back then. Well, for George and his wife Mary, this amounted to a salary of £55 per year. George was deeply unsettled by this practice because he thought it was unbiblical, especially because of the way it favoured the rich in church over the poor in church. And he was thinking particularly of James chapter 2, where James, Jesus' brother, says that we are not to show favouritism to the rich with a seat while expecting the poor to stand. Well, George couldn't ignore this command in the Bible. So to meet the church part way, George said, look, I will renounce my salary, £55, if you will get rid of all pew rents. You get rid of all of them. I'll pop a box down the back of the church, and if people want to support the church and support me, they can. Will you agree to get rid of them? The church said, okay, we'll agree to get rid of them. So picture this. This ex-thief, son of a tax collector who wanted him to become a minister, becomes a minister only to give up his salary. This just gets better and better for George's dad, doesn't it? But the point of this is that George was convinced, absolutely convinced if you can't tell, that the Bible was God's guidance for him and for the church. He knew, and I believe would agree, that God's ways are the right ways. And this is what he found in the Bible. and he did his best to live by them. Well, it was in this situation that George was aware, and remember, he's ministering in a church. George was aware that many Christians were not trusting God. They weren't believing in him, and George saw the worries and stresses this brought in their lives, and he decided to do something about it. Let me read this to you. So many believers with whom I became acquainted were harassed and distressed in mind, or brought guilt on their consciences on account of not trusting in the Lord, were used by God to awaken in my heart the desire of setting before the church at large and before the world a proof that he has not in the least changed, and this seemed to be best done by establishing of an orphan house. It needed to be something which could be seen even by the natural eye. Now, if I, a poor man, and let's remember, he doesn't have any fixed income now, simply by prayer and faith obtained without asking any individual the means for establishing and carrying on an orphan house, there would be something which, with the Lord's blessing, might be instrumental in strengthening the faith of the children of God, besides being a testimony to the conscience of the unconverted of the reality of the things of God. Well, that was a bit wordy. George liked long sentences. But let me break it down for you. George saw amongst the church that Christians were struggling because they weren't truly or fully trusting God. And please, that wasn't judgmental. In some ways, George included himself in that. But God used this observation in George's life to raise up a desire to show God as faithful. George truly believed God is faithful, guys. Guys, we can trust him. Trust him. Lean on him instead of yourself. And so in answer to this, he came up with the idea of starting an orphan house. Now, this is biblical. It wasn't just George's thought. This is biblical. God in the Bible calls for us to care for those who can't care for themselves, which is definitely orphans. And remember, these are orphans who have lost both parents. George did test this idea with others. He actually he laboured over this for quite some time. He took it to others. This is my idea, guys. Is this just me? Am I testing God, or is this the right thing to do? It certainly wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Now, that's the why he did it. The why is he wanted to prove that God was faithful. The how follows on. George wanted to prove that God was trustworthy. So if he, without any set income, didn't ask anyone for support, but only asked God through faithful prayer and God provided, then people would have to see that it was God's doing and not his. People would have to see that God was indeed trustworthy and true. Big challenge, eh? He's laying it on the line. Now, thankfully, he serves a big God, as you and I do. The orphan home started in his own rented home with his wife Mary. I don't know what that home looked like, but apparently they had room for 30 girls. I don't know how they packed them all in. 30 girls. This expanded to some other homes around them, a couple of other homes around them as things grew. But eventually the need for a separate building was obvious. I'm also a bit suspicious from the way he writes that some of their neighbours objected to the amount of children running around the street and making noise right then. This is orphan house number 1. This housed 300 children. This was number 1. This didn't happen, straight away. This came with time. This is orphan house number 2. It housed 400 children, or could house 400 children. It wasn't always at capacity. This is orphan house number 3. It could house 450 children. This is orphan house number 4. And this is orphan house number 5. So between those 5, they could, in theory, house over 2,000 children. I know in May 1870, they had 1,722 children housed amongst those 5 houses. Now let's remember, George never asked anyone for funds. Never. In saying that, he reported meticulously every dime, every halfpenny that came their way. He did that because he wanted to point to God. This is what was given, and this is where it went. George also never borrowed money, and the orphanages never went into debt. It's not too bad, eh? You know, if you talk to many ministers, one of the things they face with a little bit of dread is building projects. It's true. It takes so much time and energy. It's really, really stressful. George did this not just once, not just twice, 5 times. 5 times. I want to be clear though, it was not easy. At times they were without money for the next day, and then when someone would call past and give him £5. George recalls a time that they sat down to breakfast one morning and gave thanks for the food. There was no food in the building. They finished that prayer, and I a little bit wonder how long they prayed. But then the baker knocked on the door with enough bread for everyone, and the milkman called in with fresh milk for everyone because his cart had broken down outside. And you know, we delight in hearing these examples, don't we? And if you read his book, his own autobiography, there's just story after story after story like this. We delight in hearing these examples, and we should, but all of these tested his faith, tested their faith. And that's a reality, isn't it? It's only as your faith is tested, as you go to that place where God, I'm relying on you. I cannot do this. And you are tested, that you see God turn up. In July 1845, George writes about this, and he says, "Though now for about 7 years our funds have been so exhausted that it has been comparatively a rare case that there have been means in hand to meet the necessities of the orphans for 3 days together, yet have I been only once tried in spirit," and that was on September the 18th, 1838. It must have been memorable because I struggled to remember last week, but he remembers this day. When for the first time the Lord seemed not to regard our prayer, but when he did send help at that time, and I saw that it was only for the trial of our faith, and not because he had forsaken the work that we were brought so low, my soul was so strengthened and encouraged that I have not only not been allowed to distrust the Lord since that time, but I have not been cast down when in the deepest poverty. Hear that? He's not saying it got easier. He's just saying he had more trust in God because of it. You know, sometimes when people brought George money, he would question their motives. He'd ask them why they wanted to give money. Because if they didn't want to give it for a good reason, if they didn't want to give it because of something God had done in their lives, he'd say, "No, won't take it." Imagine that, if that's the need you're aware of. And I want to be careful here about what you take away from George Muller. He never asked for help to make a point. He was making a point about how faithful and trustworthy God is. But I want to be clear that the Apostle Paul in the Bible, who is a good model for us, he asked for help. In fact, he would share needs at times and even collect a gift for others who were in need. I just want to be careful about what you take away from this today. Yes, George just did this for a specific reason, a good reason. A reason I want to be clear, God was pleased to honour, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't share our needs. Let me just say this as your brother. If you don't share your need with me, I'm going to be a bit peeved. because that means I can't help you. And that's true of us all as well. And in case you were wondering, sometimes George wanted to do things but was stopped by a lack of funds. He absolutely had plans for other things that just never came to fruition. They did not come to pass as well. Let me show you a few more photos. Here's a girl's house. You can see they've decorated it up a little bit. You'll note the dress is fairly common amongst, well, all of these photos really. This one is one of my favourite photos. Teachers amongst us. Andrew, where are you? Sarah, there you are. Check out how many kids are in this classroom. Isn't that phenomenal? There's got to be, I don't know how many teachers in there, but whew, good on them. I didn't bother counting them, but there's a lot of them, aren't there? Here's a kindergarten. Hanging out together. And here is a baby's dormitory. Now, I want to be clear. I've talked a lot about the funds, really, about money. But I want to be crystal clear that quality was not lacking here amongst the orphan houses, not at all. One of the things that amazed me in reading his autobiography is that George got external people in to check the quality of the education provided in the schools. With all of the financial pressures and burdens, it was still a priority for him to get these external assessors in to check how they were doing. Are we doing a good job? What could we do better? The orphan houses themselves were known for their high standard of hygiene, which really paid off when disease was running rampant. We are, I think, rightly concerned over a virus or two running around today, but in the 1800s, if a disease got amongst a house of 300 to 400 children, you could imagine the consequences. And while unfortunately children did die of disease in these homes, it was quite rare, which is remarkable. Look, so much more could be said about the life of George Muller. You can read the book. There's a link to it in the news sheet, to a free PDF. It's a worthwhile read. But remember, from Muller's early life, he started in Prussia, modern-day Germany, and it was an interest in missions that took him to England, but he didn't actually get to pursue that much there. Well, he did get to pursue it in his latter years. Actually, at 70, he got to travel all around the world as a missionary sharing his story. He visited many countries, all of this without planes, of course. He visited Canada, the US, Egypt, Turkey, India, Australia, New Zealand, a bunch of other countries, sharing what God had done for him. It's estimated that in these latter years of his life, he covered some 200,000 miles. Good effort, eh? Really good effort. But as with all people, his days were numbered as well. And George died. At his funeral procession, thousands upon thousands of people came to pay their respects to a man who trusted God, and for the orphans to pay respects to their second earthly father, who had now died. So what do we take away from George? What is his message to us, to you and I, who follow him in this race of faith? If we imagine George Muller holding up a sign to encourage us to keep going in our race of faith, what would be written on that sign? I want to give you two things. Two signs. This is actually pretty easy to do because he tells us. This is George's own words. I have joyfully dedicated my whole life to the object of exemplifying how much may be accomplished by prayer and faith. Prayer and faith in God. Trusting God. I want to be clear. George worked hard. He was a hard worker. Orphan houses don't just happen. Yes, he had assistants. He had people who helped him. Absolutely, he was a hard worker. but it all started with prayer and faith in the God he trusted. You know, George it is actually known, raised £1.5 million in his lifetime. Now today, that would be the equivalent of 170 million New Zealand dollars. Not bad for that 14-year-old half-drunk thief from Prussia, eh? Pretty good. And look, I don't fully agree with George's stance on not sharing needs or asking for assistance. He did it for a very particular reason. I would be very careful before you apply that part to your own life. I don't actually think that's biblical. But I don't deny for a second that God was pleased to give us, to give you and I, George Muller, as an example, as a proof that he can be trusted. While our arms are short, God's are not. But will we pray? Will we trust his goodness and faithfulness to us? Second sign. George is holding this one up in his other hand. It's a little bit longer one. But I want to end with this, because this is key. According to my judgment, the most important point to be attended to is this. Above all things, see to it that your souls are happy in the Lord. Other things may press upon you. The Lord's work even may have urgent claims upon your attention, but I deliberately repeat, it is of supreme and paramount importance that you should seek above all other things to have your souls truly happy in God himself. Day by day, seek to make this the most important business of your life. I hope we hear these words. I believe this is George Muller's secret for you and I. It's not much of a secret. He wrote it down. He wanted everyone to know it. That in founding our joy and delight in the eternal goodness of God to us each day, we will be equipped to persevere and serve him in all that we do, wherever that might be. New Zealand probably does not need orphan homes, but it has needs. It does. And we are not alone in this world, brothers and sisters. We are not abandoned. We are not unloved. We are not orphans in this world. No, the God of all creation, the God who has spanned heaven and earth, he cares for you and I this day as he will for all days. As Paul said, if God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Brothers and sisters, is that not worth rejoicing in? Is that not worth holding on to? Is that not worth celebrating? Well, let's do that. Let's pray together. Oh, Jesus, you are so patient with us. And we confess before you that so many things grab our attention, they grab our hearts. We think our lives are found in them. We should know better, Lord. And we say we are sorry for those things that have taken your place in our lives. We put you back in that place and we delight in you. We recognize all of your goodness and kindness, your mercy to us again and again and again, that you would come and serve us with your whole life. Yes, laying down your life for us. And we want to follow you, Jesus, and we want to serve you with our lives. And we know the way to do that is indeed to delight in you. Help us to do that this week. That each day we would start by looking to you and recognizing all that we have in you, that even death cannot steal us out of your hands. Jesus, help us to be faithful. Help us to be a people of prayer, a people who trust, who indeed lean on you instead of leaning on ourselves. And then come what may, however you would use us in this world, to our neighbours, to this nation, and indeed to all the nations, that they would see and know that you are indeed the God who saves. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.